All right, so if you've just joined us on Vodcast TV, I am fortunate enough to have my colleague, it's an honor to say you're my colleague, Liezel Anguelova, who is a counselling psychologist and now resides in the Cayman Islands, like you.
Yes.
And is also the author of the book Working with Adult Survivors of Childhood Sexual Abuse. So today we're talking about quite a hectic topic, quite a powerful topic, but also a very discreet topic in society. We're talking about sexual abuse. We're talking about child sexual abuse. We'll touch on the long-term effects as well with adults. And I think before we get going, Liezel, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you're doing on the Cayman Islands.
Well, Jon, I was a psychologist in South Africa for 21 years, and then I got ill, and after illness I decided now I'm going to have to make a little bit of a life change. And then came this amazing opportunity, and I've got a job. I got an opportunity on the Cayman Islands, and I decided to go. So I've been there for 6 months. I came back for family and just to see family, and yeah, I'm almost on my way back.
I was quite fortunate to get you in this time to come on the show.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I always say, that actually I would not like to be here today, because not being here means that maybe this problem doesn't exist, and that would be great.
Right.
But this problem is, the problem of child sexual abuse. It's an extensive problem, and so I'm always grateful if I get an opportunity to do some psychoeducational work, just to educate people on what it is and what to do, and people to gain a voice, because it's kept so much in the secret, and people suffer in silence, and they don't have to.
It really is a very touchy topic in society, and a very discreet topic, and sometimes also very difficult to identify when it's actually happening. Liezel, on the Caymans, what sort of work are you doing there now? What kind of stuff are you doing?
Well, a lot of the same that I did here. I'm in part of On Course Cayman, which is a private psychological practice. So a lot of my work is with abuse survivors or sexual abuse survivors. I also do a lot of psychoeducational assessments and psycholegal work.
Okay. All right, and for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jon Pedrosa, and I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice in the Dunvegan, Edenvale area of Johannesburg. All right, I think Liezel, maybe what we can chat about is just, before we get started, is really just defining sexual abuse. I think so that we have a point of departure to punctuate off. I think there's, it's a very broad topic, and there's a lot of layers of it. So I suppose giving it a context would be the first thing. So let's talk a little bit about what is the definition of child abuse, and in the context of our country as well.
Well, in terms of definitions, it's a subject of a lot of controversy, because in research people use different definitions and then they get different results, and that becomes a problem in terms of writing about it and defining it. The difficulty in attaining consensus over what actually constitutes child sexual abuse is also a difficulty, because in some cultures, what constitutes sexual abuse in one culture is not necessarily the same in another culture. And I'm just thinking, for instance, child brides. In some cultures, selling your daughter off to your 8-year-old daughter to go and get married constitutes sexual abuse in some cultures, but not in others. So that's just an example of, the controversy. But when we come to definitions, the important thing is the perpetrator gains sexual gratification through interaction with the child. And when we talk about perpetrators, we talk about a person who has power over the child, who exerts authority over the child. And it's definitely age-inappropriate sexual behavior, age-inappropriate interaction, where the child is not aware that this is actually sexual abuse. They don't have, sometimes the children are small, they don't even have the concept of sexual formed yet. And mostly we always think that it only goes to rape, that only constitutes, but it's not. There are also kinds of types of sexual interactions that don't have, touching involved, like visual or verbal kind of pornography, for instance, speaking to a child about sexual contact that is not age appropriate. So there's also sexual boundary violation, psychological sexual boundary violation. And then we very often see, the child is not able to give legal consent. So it really, the child is underage, has no understanding of what's actually happening. It can also happen over time. Sometimes it happens once off. And yes, there can be many perpetrators. It doesn't necessarily have to be one perpetrator.
When you say it happens once, for example, once or twice, would that be the distinction between sexual assault and sexual abuse? As I understand, sexual abuse would be perhaps ongoing.
Sexual abuse is more an ongoing thing.
Okay.
Yeah, where sexual assault would probably be like a one-time rape victim, Also, in terms of sexual abuse, we have to remember that 90% of perpetrators are known to the victims, whereas and 60%, 68% are actually family members.
Wow.
So it's kind of in the circle of the child, whereas assault is more a once off, and mostly the person doesn't know the perpetrator.
Wow. So you're saying that the statistic is mind blowing. When I'm thinking about it occurring in family context and things like that, there's really just the sense of, and you mentioned power earlier, and there's really just the sense of being in a position. I was just thinking now, what came up for me is the sense of not being able to use your fight or flight modes in terms of escaping this. At the same time, I think it really just challenges one's sense of authenticity versus their attachment, and them having to cling onto this attachment because they need the parents or the parent or the perpetrator, if you want to call it that, that's for survival as well. But at the same time, is getting this very ambivalent sense of I trust you, but I don't trust you. But I trust you, but I don't trust you. That for me, sure, that can be very traumatizing and really just, I don't even know what the feeling is that comes up for me, but there's the sense of powerless, which obviously the implicit message is that the other one has to have power in some way. Okay.
And powerlessness, now that you mention it, is a problem with abuse victims, or survivors. Like powerlessness becomes a theme that runs through their lives,
right.
And often they don't disclose because they feel so powerless. Often they are so powerless in themselves that they, for instance, in a work wouldn't go for a higher position because they don't think they can do it. So it's self-esteem, but it's also they don't have power. So it's not just about the sexual abuse. It's ingrained behavioural patterns that kind of last a lifetime.
Wow.
If you don't.
So these are some of the long-term effects we're looking at as well.
Long-term effects, absolutely. And even the ambivalence you're talking about, there's a lot of ambivalence. For instance, a woman, I'm saying a woman, but there are also many men that are sexually abused, would say, well, it was the fault of my body, so therefore it was my fault that this happened. So I have a lot of guilt and blame and self and shame, and that is also a theme that kind of follows right through lifetime. So if you don't heal from feeling guilty, you're going to become guilt prone and feel guilty for everything. So in relationships, you feel guilty. If you're a parent and you don't, get to everything, you feel guilty. It just kind of follows like that. And shame, having shame in terms of this was my body. That's what kind of caught the perpetrator's eye. So my body actually betrayed me.
Well, it's interesting that you're saying that. When I'm hearing shame and guilt, and I'm hearing the sense of self-punishment in some way on oneself, this perhaps aggression or whatever it is turned inward on oneself. Why do you think that occurs?
As I said, they blame themselves, and then it becomes, it was my fault, so I must be a bad person So I, don't deserve. I don't deserve to be loved. And that often influences their interpersonal relationships. It influences their relationships with their children. It influences relationships with work colleagues. I'm not good enough. Becomes an entrenched pattern.
Wow, it really, we can see how many layers it actually has here. And it's, I'm thinking about childhood development and, especially that sense of, children don't have the vocabulary that perhaps we have as adults to express these things. And I'm wondering, when you mentioned that many cases are underreported and not disclosed, and I'm wondering also if part of it has to do with as well that the child is not in a position where they can express this and what is actually going on. And of course, there's the sense of it becoming this normal behavior, as we mentioned,
Yes.
that this is how things are, because perhaps the child doesn't know any better at that age.
Yes.
What is appropriate, what isn't. And this creates a lot of ambivalence for the child as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Also if we look at the stages of abuse, the context is not a stage, but the context in which abuse happens is very important to know, and it's important to kind of explore what happens in the child's world there, because we find that sexual abuse, the familial integrity is compromised. For instance, there is not constructive communication. The parent and child don't have, a good communication flow. Right. So the child, doesn't only have the words or the vocabulary to say it. They also don't have someone to say it to, and then it also kind of, children come from families that have much more conflict, more continuous conflict in the family. Often there's erratic communication, ineffective relationships, and a lack of closeness. There's nobody close enough to the child that the child can trust. So let us remember, the child now already doesn't trust what has happened. So the child is living almost in this bubble of mistrust. So now to reach out of that bubble of mistrust to somebody that they can trust. So if there's somebody in the family, if there's good support system and good communication, they can reach out. But if it's not there, this child is very vulnerable.
And if we think about the family system as being one's first template
Yes.
or interaction,
Yes.
there's this sense of meeting this at such an early age.
Yes.
And obviously this gets projected outward in that
Yes.
the world can't be trusted, the world
Yes.
is not a safe place.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us just a little bit about these stages that you're talking about. What are the stages of sexual abuse?
Well, the stages of abuse, and I'm going to have to refer to a research here, because the one that I often use is by Cross and Tower and of 2005. So as I said, context is a part of it, although it's not a stage, but that gives us the systemic view on how it happens. Then there's engagement. The first stage is engagement, where the perpetrator does not only exploit the child sexually, but also exploits the vulnerability of the child, the need for attention, need for affection. We're talking about a vulnerable child. These children need affection, they need attention. So if somebody just gives them attention and affection, their boundaries are already crossed. They're more likely to open up. They're more likely to participate, even if they feel it's wrong. They might be getting something from it, and perpetrators use different kind of methods for luring the child in. For example, giving the child gifts,
So there's an extreme level here of psychological and emotional manipulation.
Absolute psychological manipulation.
And obviously the child's vulnerable.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
As you're mentioning.
Yeah. And that's also kind of the grooming process, There are very few perpetrators that just, zoom in and, there it happens, the sexual abuse. There's more than often a grooming process where the child is slowly lured in.
That actually fascinates me when I hear you saying
trust.
that, this grooming process, because it almost, the grooming process is something, when we say process, we're saying it's something that takes time. It's something that needs investment, emotional investment, psychological investment, behavioural investment in it, which leaves me thinking that there's the sense of direct intent, but also implicit at the same time. This intent for achieving an outcome or a certain goal, which really, it's very troubling to hear that, or it's very conflictual to hear that, to understand or comprehend that there's the sense of investment in all this time, this process.
Yes. Look, the intent is out and out sexual gratification, but the child doesn't know that. The perpetrator knows that, and the perpetrator can then manipulate this child. If the child is easy to manipulate, this is a very vulnerable child, and you can buy one sweetie and the child's boundaries are broken down. There are other children that are a little bit more resilient, so they have to do more, but they play that game. They know the manipulation is of such nature that they kind of know exactly where to take the child to get their outcome.
What would you say is primary and secondary? Would you say that the power over the child, or the powers, is more the primary and the gratification more secondary, or vice versa? Or would you say they go hand in hand?
I think they go hand in hand, because you have to have the power to get the trust. And it's the trust that eventually gets you the gratification.
That makes sense. Okay.
And I think that's also why, it happens so much, 68% like a family member, is because there's already trust. You know this person has been around. Maybe you haven't had direct confrontation, or maybe you haven't had direct communication with a person, but the person has always been there, and the person is allowed in by the family. So if my mom and dad allow him in or her in, then they must be okay.
I can also see why that, in a familial context, this confusion comes about in terms of what is healthy relationship, what is real love, confused with the sex. I can sort of see this, how already early on these misconceptions become reality for the child, and there's these blurred lines, and where are the boundaries. So would you say that familial sexual abuse is, in terms of severity, or in terms of this process we spoke about, in terms of the grooming, and would you say that it has the most detrimental effects?
Actually, research says that. Research says, that the biggest amount of clustered symptomology is found in incest survivors.
Wow. Okay. Liezel, maybe you can just tell us a little bit, we can touch on a little bit the types of sexual abuse that we're looking at.
Okay. So in terms of types of sexual abuse, we spoke about child sexual abuse of physical contact and non-physical contact. So there's the verbal and the visual and the psychological contact. But there's also, intrafamilial sexual abuse, where it's somebody inside the family. Incestuous, where it's a mother or a father or a primary blood relative. Something that's really coming up now is child-on-child sexual abuse. It's becoming more and more rife. And often what happens there, for instance, in the Eastern Cape, statistics show that disabled children being sexually abused by able-bodied children. So there might just be a 2-year difference, but on a cognitive level, the abused child is way further behind.
Would you say in that context that perhaps this child-on-child sexual abuse has a lot to do with the access that one has to the internet these days, and how social media has become as well? I mean, there's access to pornography, which is easily accessible, just at one's fingertips.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And if you just look at the new word sexting, texting becomes sexting. It's just children sexting with each other, asking for nude pictures. This is so prominent in schools, and all over the world.
So it leaves me feeling like it's very important for parents to really be involved and to know what's going on with their children, and to know their children well. Okay.
Then there's also child pornography, and that's a very difficult thing to control. Apparently there are chat rooms now that once you've chatted, the chat just disappears. You can't actually find it again. Wow. So children are very exposed in terms of social media. And the internet, of course, is a very easily accessible tool for a pedophile. You can really do a lot of grooming on there. And it often happens that the child is groomed and groomed and groomed until they eventually meet in person. But by that time, the child has so much trust in this person they met online, the person who has been there for them emotionally, containing them. Then it's easy for them to go and meet them offline.
Okay.
There's also child trafficking, which is also fairly new, but on the increase.
With that ties, obviously that ties in with child exploitation as well.
Yes, that ties in with exploitation. And then child marriage, as we mentioned it, it was only in 2013 that the UN Human Rights actually adopted their first resolution and concluded that it's inhumane. It's that it's actually a form of sexual abuse. You can just think a little 8-year-old girl having to marry a 30-year-old man. An 8-year-old has no idea what sex is.
Well, in terms of development,
yes, in terms of development,
in terms of sexuality and things.
Their bodies are not physically, ready for such a relationship. They're cognitively they're not understanding it yet.
Right, because there's a sense of gaining control over one's body. We all get to the stage where we explore, etc., as a way of getting to know ourselves. And now, cognitively and on a psychological level and emotional as well, the child is not ready for this.
The child is absolutely compromised on all those levels. On all those levels. And also these girls fall pregnant, as soon as pregnancy is possible. Has many children, mostly research says has many children, do not have a chance to have education, sitting at home and raising children at the age of 13, so it's really a violation.
It is a big problem. Hey?
Yes, that is a big problem.
Speaking of that, maybe we can talk a little bit also about the psychological, emotional and behavioral implications of this. According to your book, Adult Survivors of Childhood Sexual Abuse. Because obviously what we're looking at here is we're looking at this process in the development, the child development that affects one.
Yes.
And this becomes pervasive over time. It becomes long-term. What sort of psychological symptoms are we looking at? And emotional and behavioral as well?
Yeah, so usually actually adults don't go to psychologists and say, for therapy because I've been sexually abused. They usually come there because there's some depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, or they have a sense of my life is just falling apart. There's nowhere where I feel successful. And then eventually after some therapy, the person will disclose. Although people really battle to disclose sexual abuse, even adults. So depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, specifically if the sexual abuse was very severe, dissociative disorder is quite prominent.
I was going to say now when you mentioned, sorry to interject there, but when you said that, there's this, I've noticed this as well in practice, clients will come, but it won't be to report that.
Yes.
But what I find is usually it's probably lingering underlying, but there's this disconnection with memory as well. When you mentioned dissociative, and I'm wondering at this age of not being able to use the fight or flight response, or one finds himself in a position of having to dissociate, sort of an out-of-body experience to sort of cope with the sexual abuse. Yes. And I'm wondering if during this time there are a lot of memories that become disfigured.
Yes, absolutely. We actually call them fragmented memories. And often in therapy, when you start therapy, so how I usually start is by asking the person to go and write their life history. And every trauma that happened, they must explain, and usually and then when they start thinking about it and they start processing it, a lot of memory influx happens. And then they come to me and they say, but I had this memory and I had this memory and I had this memory, but here I was this age and here was that age and here this age, so I can't put this together. I'm not even knowing if this really happened to me.
And also there's that underlying sense that you spoke earlier where the child starts to get to a position where they don't trust themselves
Yes.
anymore, so they don't trust their own memory.
Yes, they
and
don't
there's
trust their
what's
own
real
memory.
and what isn't.
Yes, So this, what real and what isn't, is the fragmented memory. And I always explain to them, it's like a puzzle, you know. When you have the whole puzzle, you can build the puzzle and you can see the picture and you can understand. But when you don't have the whole puzzle, it's so difficult to understand it. When you have a memory here, a memory here, a memory here, and it kind of falls apart, and you don't know if this is real or not. So can I trust my memory, or can I not trust my memory?
I think in my practice as well, I see that a lot, where there's this having to reconstruct the memories initially.
Yes.
Where they go, where they fit, how they had an effect.
Yes. And there's also the question of denial. You know, I don't want to remember. I know there's something, but I don't want to remember, because if I remember, it becomes real. And what do I do about it when it's real?
So there's that sense of understanding that it's real means one has to undergo a new transformation of identity in some way. And what am I in relation to this that has happened to me?
Yes.
Whereas if I deny it, but at the same time, denying it is also denying parts of oneself as well.
Absolutely.
So one is always found in this ambivalent position as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, definitely. And then in terms of behavior consequences, often you find aggression, in teenagers. Children, you can also find aggression. Adults have a lot of aggression, and this is not aggression directed to the perpetrator. It now has become such a festering wound that this person is just angry. Everything causes anger. You know?
So they're obviously in defense mode. Most times, sure.
And it's misdirected anger, you know. And if we have misdirected anger, so if we're just an angry person, you're going to be taking it out on other people. So your interpersonal relationships, again, we come to the consequences, will be marked by aggression, you know, and having anger outbursts. And your primary go-to emotion is anger, and often this is in men. Men often react very, angrily.
If we think about children as well for a second, we're talking about, we see this a lot in private practice, where the child is just naughty. The child we give them the label of oppositional defiant disorder, whatever it may be. I suppose something important to understand, or something for us to convey, is what are some of the symptoms we're looking at here and how they manifest. So parents can sort of identify these symptoms and not just label the child as that of being naughty or that of having a problem. Or what do you think some of these symptoms are, and how do they manifest specifically with the child? If we speak about earlier about how they cannot verbalize this,
yes.
What are some of the things that parents should look out for?
Okay. Often there's regressive behavior in children. Okay. We must remember children don't have the emotional vocabulary to say what's wrong with me. So it has to come in their behavior. So regressive behavior, things like bedwetting, enuresis, encopresis, biting their nails, sucking their thumb, doing baby talk, even though they've gone long past the stage of baby talk, and the enuresis is also long past the stage of potty training. So those are regressive behaviors. So the child's biological nature is to go back to a previous life stage, behavior at a previous life stage, because that life stage was easier.
So that's an indication that the life stage they're at now is not being dealt with. They're not coping.
They're not coping.
So that is a big indicator.
That is a big indicator. And that doesn't mean that all children that have regressive behavior were sexually abused, but that's a strong indicator that kind of, at least you have to take your child to a professional for an assessment to see what the problem is, And we also don't necessarily have always behavior problems. Sometimes behavior change can indicate. A child doesn't have to have behavior problems. If for instance, a very extrovert, happy little child suddenly becomes withdrawn, isolates themselves from their friends, isolates themselves from their family, and doesn't want to communicate anymore, that's a behavior change. So this child is behaving in discord to his personality.
Something I noticed as well.
Investigation needs to be done.
is that especially in children, it tends to manifest physiologically, so somatic symptoms.
Yes,
in other
somatic
words,
symptoms.
they feel it in
Yes.
their body a
Yes,
lot.
yes.
You know, pain, headaches,
Yes.
perhaps diarrhea,
Yeah.
perhaps. So there's a lot of
Stomach pain.
right,
Yes.
stomach pains, and
Yes.
just physical pain.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I suppose that has something with their inability to express it.
Yes, absolutely. And if your really well behaved little child suddenly becomes angry, and slamming doors and kicking the dog and fighting with you and has emotional outbursts or cries a lot where the child didn't previously do that. That is change, That should all just be investigated. It can be due to anything. It can be due to maybe something happening at school that you're not aware of. It doesn't all lead to the diagnosis of sexual abuse, but definitely needs to be
I think that's what's so
inspected.
difficult as well,
Yes.
because you've got this construct happening, the sexual abuse happening, and the manifestations of the symptoms are very explicit in them, one can see them.
Yes.
Yet it's implicit in terms of what is actually going on.
Yes.
So one can't just assume that it's sexual abuse,
No.
but it could very well be sexual abuse.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's really difficult because it's
Yes.
the symptoms are communicating the sexual abuse in some way, but also masking the sexual
Yes.
abuse in some way.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
very difficult, I think, for parents to recognize this. So
Yes.
I agree with you in that the best thing would be to take the child to a professional who can assess and
Yes.
really see what's going
Yes.
on and what's underlying there as well.
Yes. Yes. No.
Okay.
No. Because you should not be jumping to conclusions. That just creates a lot of fear in your own mind as a parent. We also have to remember that most children actually disclose to their friends, and usually the friends would tell a teacher, and a teacher would tell the mom. So usually there are like a chain of events. So it doesn't always get to the mom or the dad first. So teachers should also be aware that in classrooms, when children start having difficult behavior or different behavior, that they should just call the parents in, and say, I'm seeing your child is struggling, perhaps, get involved, get in contact with a social worker or a psychologist or a counselor, just to see what is happening,
When I'm hearing you say this, I think it's a reflection of how discreet this really is.
Absolutely.
This secret, if you want to call
Absolute
it, and one
secret,
only
yeah.
finds out through the grapevine. It's almost this thing that we don't talk about, and it just makes me think about how important it is to break the silence in our society.
Absolutely. The silence. It's the silence that actually kills you at the end, or kills your soul. Because you're suffering, and if you're suffering in silence, your whole life is a suffering, and there are very many life areas affected. For instance, your interpersonal relationships, mental health. We spoke about depression and anxiety. There are your in terms of yourself, your self-esteem, and your body concept, and often survivors develop self-content. They're not content with themselves, and and then starts self-destructive behavior. And we always think self-destructive behavior is cutting yourself, burning yourself, pulling your hair out, things like that. But there's also other destructive ways, like, for instance, starving yourself, not eating. We get to eating problems, which could be a cause, a consequence. Comparing yourself consistently with someone else and just not ever being good enough. That's self-contempt. And driving extremely fast because of this rage. You put yourself in danger. You put others in danger.
So you end up in the cycle of being at risk all the time anyways, if that makes sense. So you were at risk when you were going through the sexual abuse, but now you put yourself in a position where you're at risk anyway.
Yes.
You made me think of something now when you said about this disclosing and not telling, and telling, and you often find in society, I've seen that especially in my private practice, we often treasure our problems as prized possessions.
Yes.
Right, and there's something very interesting that happens as to where we share this. There's a sense of, sharing or unburdening the responsibility in some way. In other words, once you know something, you can't unknow it. So there's that sense of, if I share this with you, you've witnessed it and you're somehow part of that.
Yes.
But I think it's difficult, and it probably has a lot to do with the Western society, this individualistic sense of self.
Yes.
That our problems should be kept to ourselves and not shared with anybody.
Yes.
So I suppose one way of breaking the silence, would be that sense of understanding that once somebody knows about this, it cannot be unknown, and that they're part of it, and you share this burden and responsibility with people, and that's probably why it's so important to talk about these things.
Yes, no, it's incredibly important to talk about it, and that. But most victims actually don't disclose, even if there's corroborative evidence. There might be medical evidence. There might be people that have witnessed it that are saying, but I saw this happen, and the person will still say, no, it didn't.
Would you say that happens a lot in a family context?
Yes.
In that the child, there's the sense of, if we just think about that triangle of the victim, the perpetrator, and the rescuer as well. The child almost is the victim, but also becomes the rescuer in a sense of trying to protect the parent, perhaps.
Yes, and protecting the whole family system. Because say it's the dad or the mother who is the perpetrator. The mother or the dad might be taken out of this family, and then this family's livelihood is a danger. So rather keep it to myself, because the consequences that is going to happen is going to be felt by my whole family. I often see, and if I say often, there is often, if one child is being abused, is so afraid that the same happens to, I'm working with a family like that now, so afraid that the same happens to her sister, that she just keeps quiet. So that, they can't expose dad, because if they expose dad, maybe she gets taken out of the family, and then dad is going to abuse her sister.
So it really leaves...
protective measures, protecting the family system.
Right. So the roles, there's a lot of discrepancy around the role of the child and what the child's role is, having to play these different roles.
Yes.
Being the protector, but not being able to even protect oneself at that time.
Absolutely.
So I think I'm seeing a little bit more when we spoke about earlier about the guilt and the shame that comes with it as well, especially in that context. It's quite interesting, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So prompt disclosure obviously is the best, because if there's a prompt disclosure, it's kind of, it buffers the impact of severe abuse. So abuse often starts, as we said, the grooming process. So there's first a little bit of grooming, and then going to the stage of the actual sexual interaction happening, and then it being kept a secret. And then as the secret is kept more and more, the abuse becomes more severe, So if you have a prompt disclosure, that can be a buffer to that. But it's also less likely for the abuse to then continue, So disclosing means stopping it. So our first priority almost is just to help the child disclose. Children find it very difficult to disclose, and because we spoke about this distrust bubble. They live in this distrust bubble. So if they can't even trust their family members, how are they going to trust a professional outside? So when you are interviewing a child or doing an assessment, you really have to make sure that you are qualified and that you're knowing what you're doing. Because if the child discloses to you, you have to protect that child after that. Not protecting the child after that would lead the child to putting you as a professional also in a perpetrator category,
right.
Because you also broke the trust. If you are now going to the police and the police, takes the whole system apart, then this child is going to feel, they can't trust you either.
It's a really difficult position to be in as well, because if you're looking at the treatment and when you see the child, obviously the safety is first and foremost. But safety doesn't really mean safety. It means taking all these other things into consideration that creates a sense of safety. And, as a professional, I think it also puts one in an ambivalent position as well. what is the
Absolutely.
correct thing to do and what isn't the correct thing. And of
Yeah.
course, there's all the ethical dilemmas around that as well, as I'm sure
Yes.
fellow practitioners can relate as well to
Yes.
this. So in terms of treatment, what are we looking at in terms of treatment?
Well, if you're starting, if you have a child that you're treating, obviously you're going to do work in a different way than to an adult. With adults, I usually start with writing a life history, just for this person to actually understand the reality of the situation. And I find once you start writing, you're actually taking it from your heart and you're putting it on paper, and it becomes reality. Also, when it comes from here to here, there's a slight distance.
Right.
So there's not objectivity. Obviously, you can't expect objectivity. It can come later, but there's a little bit of, a distance, a little bit of I can look at this now, almost as if it's not mine.
A sense of being the author of your own story,
Yes, the author
but
of
still
your own
looking at
story.
it. There's something interesting about language when it leaves us and putting words to certain things, which sort of becomes more conscious, if you will, because you're thinking about how you display this feeling or emotion and how you can put it down, right?
And then if you take the life history and you work with it with the person, with the survivor, and you actually identify themes, you identify, often work with memories in denial first. Why would you want to be in denial? And when you're busy working with memories, there's also often a memory influx, which is sometimes good, but it's very difficult. So you have to be very there. You have to be in a very good therapeutic relationship to be able to manage that. You also have to be quite available in the beginning, because it's really hard when all these memories come up. Then I work with stages of sexual abuse, for the person to understand the context that I was in made me vulnerable. I needed this attention. That's why I was a easy victim. I'm not a bad person. I was an easy victim. It's quite a mind shift for people to make. Then we work with prominent problematic emotions, and usually I start with feelings of guilt, self-blame, and shame, because once a person can realize it wasn't my fault, I'm not the guilty party here. I'm not to blame. I don't have to carry shame for this. And once I start realizing it was actually the responsibility of the perpetrator who knew what he or she was doing, they kind of let up a little bit, Okay, so it wasn't me. So I can actually stand back a little bit. And when I don't have to blame myself anymore, I can actually work with some of these emotions, because it's not my fault that I have these emotions. It's the consequence of something else.
Which I suppose in the long run also allows one to shift out of the sense of, because initially the sense of feeling guilt, etc., would be that of being in a victim role, and eventually getting to a survivor role of some sort, letting that go and understanding that it's not my fault and that this was the responsibility of somebody else, and really puts one in a position of making that transition. Would you say that on this level of treatment, if we're talking about it and where one starts and where one has to get, because it seems to me that there's a lot of coming to therapy, you've defined yourself in a certain way, okay, when you start, as we spoke about, there's this victim, there's this almost a sense of like one would undergo a grieving process for oneself.
Absolutely.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Shedding parts of oneself is what one is doing.
This identity of it's my fault, I'm not good enough, I got myself into this situation, I'm not worthy to be loved, shedding that part of the identity, those negative feelings about yourself, inadequate cognitive constructs about yourself.
But I also suppose if you having to accept parts of yourself as well, that this happened, and I have to accept that this is part of who I am now. I think on some level it also, or at least what I've seen in my own private practice, is that it really puts one in an existential crisis, the sense of, but now who am I now? Because now I've accepted that this is part of who I am. And where does this leave me in relation to that of others as well?
That's why therapy is a process. You can't just take that identity of the victim away. You have to have like a bridge. I'm a victim, but I'm going to be a survivor. So I'm going to have a new identity, which still is linked to this one, but it's I have bridged, I've gone from, and then going to thriver. And if I can just, share kind of what is the difference between victim, survivor, and thriver is, for a victim is somebody who's still in the trauma, the thoughts and feelings and behaviors are still present, and the person is still permeated by trauma. And they need to kind of be saved, and a preoccupation with the past. They're kind of hooked on the past and cannot plan how to get out of it.
And what's interesting to me is that one never forgets this in any way.
No, you're never going to forget it.
Right, especially when the memory becomes prominent. There's no forgetting it.
Yes. No, you can't forget it. But, as I said, the bridge. So this person, this victim, is always going to be a part, but it doesn't have to rule who you are.
Of course, because the mourning the emotions around this is really taking the experience and making it part of oneself and integrating it into oneself and understanding that the ability to do that really puts one in a survivor role.
Yes, and when you're a survivor, you're outside of the trauma, and that's where the bridge comes from. So you're outside of what was happening here now. So you can somewhat start looking in. That's where some objectivity comes in. And you can start integrating the trauma into your life. It's not so self-consuming anymore. You can actually look at it and say, okay, this did happen to me, but I don't have to define myself by what happened to me. I can identify myself with new characteristics. I'm going to find out who I really am minus sexual abuse.
It's almost that sense of it's important to know who one is, but it's also important to know who I'm not and who I still have potential to become, integrating all these things, this redefining a narrative for oneself.
Yeah, and starting to take control, of your thoughts.
Which
and
is very
your
empowering.
beliefs. Yes, it is empowering. And that's where the survivor starts coming out, where you take control of your thoughts and your feelings and your behavior. And your thoughts and feelings and behavior become congruent. You don't feel something, do something, and think something different. They're becoming more congruent. So it's establishing a new identity.
And establishing that sense of genuineness for oneself, which I suppose understanding and engaging in that genuineness really teaches one to achieve that, really teaches one to engage in self-care and that sense of being gentle on oneself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
and seeing your potential, and seeing that I could go from victim to survivor. So I have the ability to change. I have someone on my side that's going to be there with me. I can identify my resources. I'm not in such a position of mistrust where I can't trust anybody to support me anymore.
Do you think that, if we're talking about this, do you think that forgiveness, obviously forgiveness is an important concept, but do you think that forgiveness for the perpetrator is important, or forgiveness for oneself? Or are they the same thing?
Well, forgiveness to me is probably not the forgiveness that would traditionally be, a definition of forgiveness. So forgiveness for me is not about the perpetrator.
Okay.
It's not about saying what you did is okay. It will never be okay. It will never be okay what that person did. Forgiveness to me is to say that I don't want to carry this brick or this load. I don't want to carry that anymore. So I have to let it go so that I can be okay. That doesn't mean you're saying what the perpetrator did is okay.
No.
So for me, that is forgiveness. The letting go is forgiveness.
Okay. So letting go of parts of oneself, for example,
letting
would be
go
part
of
of the
parts of
forgiving.
oneself,
And knowing that that's okay as well.
Yes, and knowing that's okay, and letting go of certain learned behavior, certain behavior that you learned, like you had to learn a flight behavior to get out of that situation, or a fight behavior. Taking that behavior and learning new behavior makes you also new. And that to me is forgiving yourself. When you're renewing yourself and you're realizing and really can claim that I did not do this to myself.
So it's really an opportunity, or I don't want to say opportunity, but the sense of reclaiming one's new identity and building it up this new identity,
Yes,
and a
absolutely.
decision to decide who I want to be going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and then moving to a thriver is cementing your recovery. You know, like for instance, the powerlessness we spoke about. Being a powerless victim, the powerlessness pulls through, and then you also become powerlessness at work. So when you're cementing your recovery, you can go for that new job opportunity because you're not powerless anymore.
Right.
You know, that consequence has now been dealt with. You're giving yourself permission to be your authentic self, and not what the abuse caused your identity to become.
Not what the abuser defined you to be.
Yes,
Sure.
yes.
That's very powerful. That you mentioned now. It's very empowering.
You know, and having your life in your own hands and saying, I'm able to plan what I want. I'm not just a victim caught up in all of this trauma anymore. I'm allowed to say what I actually want. I have a voice.
Regaining one's power.
Yes, gaining your power, getting a voice, you know, not being caught up in that secrecy. Then you're becoming a thriver. You know, when you recognize you're a meaningful person and you're contributing.
And I suppose that speaks to the existential crisis in a sense, because you find that sense of why in life, that sense of the meaning in the whole purpose, or in the whole, or why this happened. There's the sense of, so in this process of developing this identity, one puts the existential crisis at bay, or answers it, if you want to call it that, in some way. It's very powerful. Very powerful.
Yeah. Healing is very powerful, you know, and I think it's I think it was Norman Vincent Peale that said, you know, it is of practical value to learn to like yourself. Since you must spend so much time with yourself, you might as well get some satisfaction out of the relationship.
Right.
You know?
The only person you live with for the rest of your life is yourself.
You're the only person that you're going to see 24/7.
But I've also noticed that, I mean, healing also begins with a decision as well.
Absolutely.
And one must decide.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you're powerless, you know, you're not going to decide.
Right.
If you don't like yourself, why would you like to heal yourself?
Right.
You know? But yes, I really...
Which is a lot of the ambivalence as well.
Yes.
Do I report this? Do I speak about it? Do I get the help? Do I disclose this or don't I? Because it's as odd with how one perceives oneself.
Yes.
The worthlessness, the low self-esteem.
And that's why people often get to therapy when they start getting involved in their worlds, you know, their lives in terms of work, into their you know, the romantic relationships, parental relationships, and you really start realizing, oh my gosh, I'm not coping with this, and I'm not coping with this, and I'm never good enough. You know, at work I'm not good enough. I'm not a good enough wife. I'm not a good enough mother, or I'm not a good enough father. That's when they start realizing that the sexual abuse actually had much more of an impact than they would like to give it a chance.
Liezel, let's talk a little bit about, before we end off, just support systems. What are we looking at when we talk about support systems?
So I think what's important for support systems is when you're in therapy, I think it's important for the partner of that person to also be a part of the therapy, not all of it, but to become a part of the therapeutic process that this person follows, so that you can be a support, but also the victim or the survivor is going to change, and you must understand that change to be able to support that. And you must, you know, offer understanding in terms of where the person is in terms of the healing process. So that's very important for support. I think in terms of support, you also have to have perhaps friends that you can talk to. So that sounds very difficult for a victim, because they battle to disclose. So how am I going to now say this to many people is very threatening. So it's very difficult for survivors or victims to get a support system. Often they go to therapy and they engage in group therapy. And there's a lot of support.
So there would be support system in terms of professionals, fellow professionals, and things, psychologists, perhaps going to see a
professional, definitely. Professional, definitely. But if you can join a group, it's even more so. Because then you're going to meet people who've gone through the same as you, and you're not going to feel so alienated. And it's going to normalize what you've been through. And that victims and survivors find that very supportive. So professional help, your family, a friend circle, slowly getting one person, until you can trust more than one.
Okay, that's important. All right, thanks, Liezel, for being here. We had a great discussion on sexual abuse, which was very fascinating, as we can see how many layers there are to this and how broad this is and how serious it is in society. And I think from this, or in general, and what I've seen in private and things like that, what makes me quite sad about it, if I want to call it that, is how discreet it is as well, and how it's not spoken about. And if we imagine ourselves as being that of the victim in this position of feeling like I have no one to talk to about it, can become really, really traumatizing and difficult for one, and lonely as well, feeling alone. So if you do identify with this video and you are going through something like this, reach out and ask for help as well. Also, we'll be giving away 5 copies of Liezel's book, which is Working with Adult Survivors of Childhood Sexual Abuse. Liezel, it's been an honor. I never expected to ever be here with you discussing sexual abuse, and it was a real pleasure having you, so thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Jon. Thank you for the opportunity.